Hi, my name is Erin Hughes. I'm a recent graduate of Kennesaw State University where I received a Master's of Science in Civil Engineering. During my time at Kennesaw State, my thesis research aimed to develop a prescriptive criteria to outline a method for designing amphibious foundation systems. This presentation will discuss why amphibious design deserves further research and consideration as an acceptable mitigation strategy, and will provide a review of the methodology used in my research and the results of my research. These are the 4 topics we will be discussing today. Why amphibious design? First, let's talk about flooding. Flooding is the #1 disaster in the US and worldwide in terms of frequency and monetary losses. $41.2 billion. That's the cost of flood-only disasters in the US in the past 5 years. This number doesn't include losses from tropical weather like hurricanes. When we include losses from tropical weather events, that number increases to $427.7 billion. FEMA is responsible for the means and methods for flood mitigation and retrofitting structures. Right now, FEMA only recognizes these items as acceptable mitigation strategies for reducing flood risk. And they can only be implemented in a residential structure prior to a flood event. After a flood event, if a structure has been substantially damaged, we can only implement elevation, relocation, and demolition. Floodproofing and barrier systems are reserved for commercial structures after they've been substantially damaged. During a flood event, the use of traditional static elevation can have catastrophic impacts. Here you can see in the bottom picture, this was taken in the Florida Keys following the passage of Hurricane Irma, and the foundation and soils were scoured during the flood event that resulted in the collapse of the structure. The top image is what that structure looked like prior to the hurricane. Also following Hurricane Irma, further up in Florida, this elevated structure was susceptible to breaking waves acting on the underside of that superstructure, which resulted in a partial collapse. This was taken in Cameron, Louisiana after Hurricane Laura, where a structure that was elevated above the BFE was susceptible to higher wind forces due to its elevation, and it resulted in a total loss of the superstructures. And then just down the beach from that, at a lower elevation relative to sea level, the height of water from storm surge and breaking waves exceeded the height of these 12-foot piles and resulted in the structure being washed away and the collapse of that foundation system. So let's talk about amphibious design. What is an amphibious structure? An amphibious structure is a structure that rests on the ground during normally dry conditions, but is allowed to rise under flooded conditions. And amphibious structures use Archimedes' principle of buoyancy, which allows that structure to move up and down with rising and receding floodwaters. Movement in the lateral directions and rotation of the structure is going to be restricted by guidance posts. There's a handful of amphibious structures that already exist around the world. You can see some of them pictured here. During the literature review stage of my research, I quickly realized that a lot of these applications were designed on a case-by-case basis, and none of them actually provided a criteria for replicating the design or for applying the design principles to other structures. So my personal goal in my research was to make a meaningful contribution to the knowledge base surrounding amphibious structural design. The objectives I had for my research were to create a prescriptive criteria for designing a dual foundation system that could adequately resist flood loads. In an effort to make this research fill an existing research gap, I had to develop the criteria in a way that could be easily replicated and could be applied to the design of any structure, regardless of its size or its configuration. Finally, I had to determine if that design criteria was going to indeed be a cost-effective approach that could reduce future flood losses if it was implemented during the construction phase. So these are the basic code references that are used in structural design that actually address flood loads. I use these references, but then I manipulated some of the equations that are found within them in order to allow buoyant forces to actually occur in design. So this illustrates the basic concept of an amphibious structure, where under normally dry conditions, that structure is situated on the ground on its static foundation system, which is found right here, and is basically designed the same way a basement can be. It can be a varying depth depending on where the water table is or any other factor that you need to consider. Then once a flood occurs, that structure is designed in a way where it's going to rise with floodwaters. So here you kind of have like the depth of this floodwater here. And this is what we're considering the design flood elevation. The design flood elevation is going to be the elevation where flood protection and mitigation is going to be required. But in this specific application of amphibious designs, that depth is going to be based upon the depth of water at which that structure becomes buoyant, not based upon the base flood elevation. So turn off my thing. On the next slide, you can see this kind of gray portion here is going to be the area that's below that design flood elevation. And above that design flood elevation, we have typical wood framed structure with sheathing and a brick cladding. And then you have your guidance posts that run all the way from the base foundation system up through the superstructure. So everything that's going to be below this design flood elevation has to be completely flood resistant and create a watertight barrier, because that's the part that's going to be submerged when that building is floating. In my criteria, I specified the use of HHS members, which is just square tubes that you kind of see here, to be used as a restraint system. The spacing and sizing of these vertical restraints depends on the lateral forces that are going to act on the superstructure during a flooded condition, and it's going to include a combination of both wind and flood loads. The vertical restraints are part of a two-part system where a smaller HHS member that you see here is inserted into a larger HHS member that you see here, and they are like tightly fitting, and they kind of act like this bigger one acts as like a guidance sleeve to the lower one. The larger one is just going to be basically framed right into the superstructure, and that way it can act independently of the one that is going to be bolted down to the foundation here. The maximum height that you can have of like an amphibious design using this type of restraint system is going to be equal to that height of that superstructure. As I previously mentioned, I was able to manipulate and rewrite the traditional flood load equations in order to allow buoyancy, and those rewritten equations are shown here on this slide. With regard to wind loads, I had to do a little bit of manipulation on how those wind loads are distributed on the building. And so you can see on the left here, that's going to be wind pressures under normally dry conditions, and that's a standard wind pressure diagram. On the right, when you get under flooded conditions, you're going to have a little additional area that becomes available right above the flood line, and those wind forces in that location are going to be pretty minimal. But under both the normally dry and the flooded conditions, the wind loads are equivalent or fairly equivalent to those that would act on a traditional slab-on grade house. This is going to eliminate any of those elevated wind forces that act on statically elevated structures and kind of provide a form of wind mitigation during those normally dry conditions. So after I outlined a proposed criteria for designing an amphibious foundation, I attempted to use that criteria and applied it to the design of a specific structure. This slide and the next slide are going to show that the restraint that I designed was acceptable, both at the design flood elevation and the maximum flood elevation. That maximum flood elevation is basically going to be the elevation when the restraints are fully extended. So this slide's showing the design flood elevation structural results. And here we have the results at the maximum flood elevation. The most important aspect of any mitigation strategy is determining if it's economically advantageous. So in order to make that determination, I conducted my own theoretical loss avoidance study. In this study, I used data regarding losses to 286 structures which were statically elevated above the base flood elevation during the passage of Hurricane Michael in Mexico Beach, Florida. All of the data that I used was real data, and it's publicly accessible. The data that I couldn't access was the actual value of losses for damaged structures, but I was able to use FEMA's estimated flood loss potential tables to assign expected monetary losses to each of the elevated structures in the area of interest. Based on my calculations, an estimated $62.7 million in losses occurred in this area of Mexico Beach, Florida as a result of the flooding during Hurricane Michael. I then did a cost estimate to determine the additional amount that it would have cost to make all of the statically elevated structures amphibious structures at the time of original construction. My calculations revealed that the cost of the amphibious foundation was approximately 125 to 150% higher than the cost of a traditional slab-on-grade or pile foundation system. It's important to note that that percentage is just the additional cost of the foundation system and doesn't reflect like the increase in the cost of the overall structure. So in the case of Mexico Beach, had all of the statically elevated structures been constructed as amphibious structures at the time of construction, the additional cost that would have been spent in construction would have been approximately $20.9 million. In comparing that to the potential losses that could have been avoided during Hurricane Michael, there would have been a nearly 200% return on their investment for implementing amphibious foundation systems as a mitigation strategy. The development of a systematic approach to amphibious structural design and the creation of a successful prescriptive design criteria is an integral component to the widespread acceptance of amphibious structures as a recognized mitigation design strategy. Amphibious structures can help to protect structures, their occupants, and contents against damage from floods without increasing their vulnerability to elevated wind forces, to reduce the potential for repetitive losses, to allow structures to remain fully accessible during normally dry conditions, and to retain community character and the standard relationship between a structure and the ground. In order to be recognized by FEMA as an acceptable mitigation strategy and adopted into the building code, scientific data from engineering calculations and testing similar to that presented in my research must be qualified to prove that this initiative can work on any scale and it's both cost-effective and sustainable. This research is uniquely important because it provides a solution to structural mechanisms that fail repeatedly and get reconstructed based on the same design methods and same design principles that failed the first time. If we want to see forward progress towards adequately mitigating the effects of flood disasters, we should be building and rebuilding stronger and smarter, not the same. Thank you all so much for your time today. Please feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn or email if you have any comments, questions, or just want to say hi.